So getting back to how Mouse ruined comics.
Okay.
All right, 30 seconds. Your 30 seconds are up. No more boomer music.
Stop right there, criminal scum.
Well, there we are. Wait, that's the wrong button. Hang on. There we go. That's the one I meant. Hey, It's another Wednesday. It's another episode of the Mattriarchy. And I have to ask the panel, guys, did anybody else hear the weird audio artifacts in the intro? Or was
there was
that
something going on with
Yeah,
the
I
intro.
heard it kind
I don't know
of
what.
skip there.
It might have been my
You have
connection.
a-
I don't know.
Did you have a nuclear pile next to your computer or anything?
that I
Nuclear
know
pile?
of.
No, I do
Nuclear?
have a loud computer,
Loud. Maybe
but
that's
I
it.
think my mic was muted. It's probably just a connection problem if you were hearing artifacts.
Well, that looks like it. That might make sense. Ladies and gentlemen, here on the Mattriarchy, we know that you guys come. You all you guys out there in YouTube, the YouTube village, you come to our show to get the most thought out answers on the history of comics that are available on YouTube. Which is why we're entirely making the show up as we go right in front of you. So
Subverting expectations.
entirely.
No, I think that is the expectation at this point.
If
The
Hot Take
expectation
had a
is that
fate-
Reese's computer is going to crash in about 15 minutes.
Ooh, low blow.
It's not low. It's true. So it says I've got 29 minutes. So audio artifacts like those old wax recordings Edison did. That's amazing. Not what I meant, but that's an awesome pun, and I approve. Okay, so if I was halfway together, I would share an image that's kind of kicked this all off. Over the weekend, my pal and a sometime employer, Nick Mueller, posted over on Twitter this message that I don't have keyed up because I am the worst. But basically, it was I'm sorry, I'm terrible at it. I got to look it up. I can't remember it off the top of my head enough to remember anything. It's the worst.
I actually
Hey,
saw
let me say
your
something while it's
reaction on
not so
that,
it's not
too.
dead air.
When you said it was going to be basically the next.
He posted.
topic
He
in
dared.
there.
He dared post. I was gonna say Nick Mueller dared post an unsolicited opinion on the history of comics. And we
Well,
all
it
know how
wasn't
that
even
makes
an
Reese
opinion
feel.
to be, and it wasn't even an opinion to be completely, perfectly, 100% honest. Is that somebody else had an opinion, and Nick said, "Hey, Twitter fan followers, what do you think
I'll
about
retweet this. Yeah.
I'll retweet this to start a conversation." And I said, and I said, that's ridiculous. So there we go. This is the image. And I was instantly annoyed.
Copper Age.
Can anybody guess why I was instantly annoyed? We'll start with that. Let's do a little guess.
Well, I hate the word Copper Age because that doesn't even follow up with like the Greek Hellenistic ages. It should be Bronze Age at that point, but
Right. Modern Age is sliding, and what it's showing is from the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
So here was I'll just spoil this here. What really got me annoyed was that Watchmen and
I called it.
90s
I said it was Watchmen.
and 90s McFarland are part of the same ethos. They're the same thing. So you can't separate McFarland out as a modern age book and say that Watchmen is something that's not modern.
Right.
Because it's part of the same thing. And I'm willing to say that, Watchmen's was a pivotal moment in the history of American superhero books, right? But it's not that it's a different thing than what McFarlane was doing in like 92 for Marvel, and then in '93 for Image.
Is it
whatever.
because it takes place like back in the 70s?
Watchmen?
Yeah.
It does take place in something like the '70s.
Well,
Parts
that
of
shouldn't
it.
matter when a book takes place. It's when a
Yeah.
book is
Right.
made.
It's artificially bringing itself back to the...
Yeah. Well, I imagine that the whoever put this list together was trying to point to the impact that Watchmen had upon comics that came after it. But it's just like the gritty realism of '90s books was absolutely influenced by Watchmen. Watchmen is not it's a product of that in a very direct fashion.
Yeah.
And so
And-
I
and-
say,
So I think
Sorry.
I think the separation is between, because I'm willing to give a little bit of slack here with those two categories, regardless of what you name them.
Yeah.
Because Watchmen, I think, is '80s, and what they're pointing with modern is '90s, and there is a difference there. And here's where it gets okay. Oh gosh, I think we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit.
we are definitely,
Yes.
but I wanted to set the stage
Gotcha.
with
Okay.
the Image so that we can go ahead and use
That's
this
fair.
as a bouncing point
Gotcha.
to talk
Yeah.
about all of this. Another thing that kind of spurred this on, and I was hoping that he would be able to make it today, but he had family stuff come up and it just was a no-go. I'm going to go ahead and lose this screen. Was I talked to Englentine, and he had been, but he's got family stuff and wasn't able to make it. But I invited him again because he'd been talking on one of his streams a few months ago about Platinum Age books, meaning those foundational newspaper comics that really defined the comic genre and invented word balloons and all that kind of stuff. And Winsor McKay and Richard Occult and a bunch of other guys like that. And so I thought that would be a really good
You're
play.
talking about comic strip. Yeah. It's
Yeah.
No, I see what you're talking about. It's basically you're talking about the precursors essentially to
Exactly.
what we typically see. Yeah.
When comics became
it's called
Right.
antediluvian by some people. I'm not
yeah,
kidding.
well, I would agree with that because comic books per se post-date the innovation and wild popularity of comics as a medium. But I also think that much of the attitude around comics in America is so overwrought with the funny books that we forget the larger scope of what American comics are. And so I think we narrow ourselves too much with that.
That shirt is perfect for this discussion because that's exactly what you're talking about. The invention of the grid and the layout and the impact words and things like that.
The emanata. Anyway, I have to be completely honest, and it was half accidental when I picked my shirt out this morning. So, and to give the whole thing of it, it says, "Sorry, I can't talk. I have reading to do." That's the shirt. Merry Christmas from my sister-in-law. Thank you.
And as much as I love all that stuff, I hate how every news article that they ever make on a comic book is, wham, boom. I always hope it with a couple of things in the headline. It's like, that's not what comic books are about, but everything is, the Batman TV show to newspaper reporters. I had an article written about my book once, and it's like, that's always the headline if they're going to talk about comic books. Pow, bam, we're doing comic books. It's like, oh.
Well, you got to admit that onomatopoeia is a pretty cool and interesting art form that really only shows up in comics.
Largely, it doesn't, especially at least in the. Well, I mean, poetry has a big place for onomatopoeia as well. But I think,
it can't do so visually, is what I'm saying.
Oh no,
I mean, literally an art form.
Yeah. Okay. I'll give you that.
I've got the link I wanted.
Here we go. Hiroshi says has the best First Paradox and Riserman have joined us, and with the best comment, "Pow, wham! Comics aren't just for kids anymore."
The amount of newspaper articles that essentially have that headline is it's obnoxious, and I think that it's basically their go-to now when it's like, hey, person who's out of touch who's going to write about comics, and it's like the first two words that come into their head.
I mean,
It
we
would
all
be
know
the,
that
It's a macro.
astronaut meme where it's like it never was.
I think
Right.
we all
Well,
know at
that's-
this point that journalists don't have a creative bone in their body.
Hey,
No, okay,
Hey.
I need to introduce you to a guy named Joe Sacco. I'm sorry.
I was going to be a journalist, you jerk.
Aren't you glad you dodged that bullet?
I technically am a journalist, so you know.
Metal, what don't you do?
That's actually a really good question.
I used to write actually articles for a journalist website that you all know and have heard of for comics. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So you're not just gonna say it, okay? that's
Don't tell us.
I wrote articles for CBR. You can actually still look them up. So like, I wasn't part of their news section, but yeah.
See, didn't that feel good? Don't we all feel edified? I know I do.
I wasn't
CBR
trying to-
wasn't always trash, so that's
No,
That's what I'm
CBR
saying. It
used to
became trash right around the point where I started writing for them. So I'm not saying those two things completely coincided. That one of them was led into the other, but
Oh man, that's amazing. That's amazing. Pardon me a moment. That was awesome. I did not expect that. That took me off.
Yeah, no, my journalism's mostly centered towards video games, but I have done journalism, so you've got journalists on your panel, okay? Watch what you say.
Watch what you say.
I was just saying,
Make it grittier, make it sharper if you're going to cut
read
'em.
Palestine and tell me that journalists aren't creative.
I mean, you realize all I just said was something equivalent of politicians are all trash, right?
Well, yeah, but that's also true.
Cartoonicus way with words.
That's a really low bar for me.
Yeah.
I believe all humans are trash, so it's really.
Yeah.
Please.
I mean, I call me
Okay,
naive.
we are quickly derailing Ages of
Yeah.
Comics.
Yeah,
One more
it's
joke.
comics.
Call me naive, but I do still believe our politicians are human. You know,
Jeez.
I mean,
I
some
don't-
of them might be lizards.
I see. I just can't abide the lizard man hypothesis.
I think right now it is relegated just to what's his name? Blah, blah, blah. Facebook guy.
Oh, Zuckerberg.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
He's a replicant.
So, with Ages, where do we start?
Well, like I said, I think it's important to take the broad scope of comics history, American comics history, into shape, because and I think calling it antediluvian is reasonable. I do like the term the Platinum Age, because I do think there are so many innovations in those newspaper strips, in Crazy Cat, in Little Nemo,
Can I
that
throw
like
some problems into the mix before we even get started?
go for it. Have yourself.
So scholars who have discussed this, there's at least one that I know of. I think his name is Wu, and he talks about the problems of approaching the aging system in general. So I'm gonna kind of outline just a little bit of his argument, and then we can maybe pick that apart. But he says that part of the problem is the fact that the way the age system is set up, at least from a scholarly perspective, is the fact that it is a focus on American comics. So if you say the golden age of comics, you're basically talking about a very narrow subset of something that's a much larger conversation. Because like the golden age of comics with manga starts with Tezuka, I believe. At least from people who kind of look at it from Japan, and then Bond is an A is an entirely separate affair. So
We can just say American comics if we want to just not have this conversation go all
right. No, yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like,
about European and everything.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So like that's one of the problems though, is that if you say that article, the golden age of comics, you already have kind of walked into a rake in terms of the conversation a bit.
Listen here, pal. The World Series is played where? Thank you.
It's America. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. So that's like problem number one.
I mean, we
then
call our country after the entire continent. I think we're justified. I'm just
Yeah.
Problem number
And
two.
we have Mr. Universe here, so he rules the
Problem
whole
number
universe.
two with the ages system is that it also tends to focus on not only one country, but one genre.
Mhm.
Because the dating basically follows one genre of comics, which also narrows our focus and and sometimes effaces the fact that comics, the medium of words and panels and artwork, sequential art, and so on, it exists far beyond superheroes, even though I love them.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it basically is a dating system that is a very, very, very narrow. It can still be valuable. So this is where I think I depart from Wu's perspective, because part of the other problem of this, right, is you run into a BCE issue, which is it doesn't matter what the scholars try to call a particular subset of time. If everyone just calls it BC, you're not going to get away from that. Everyone just dates things from the birth of Christ. So it doesn't matter how hard you want to get away from before Christ and Anno Domini. You can't get away from the fact that people have dated time surrounding Christ for so long. You're just not going to make any, ground there. So those are kind of two sides to this, is that there are problems with the ages system if we try to think about this scholastically, but there's also the fact that people just use it. So there is usage and there is usefulness in terms of unpacking some of it, at least, because there's at least two ages on here that I think are fairly, I would say, universal, that even the scholars just kind of like, yeah, we just kind of accept this one. And so the first two, golden and silver, are fairly uncontested. There's a little bit of wiggle room where someone says where one of them begins and ends a teeny bit, but it's basically accepted. This is the golden age. This is the silver age. And I think those two are the strongest ages that we have for the American industry of superhero comics. You can't get away from either of the two of those.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And a big part of that, I think, comes down to the fact that the invention of the comic book really created. It took this idea of comics and it exploded the market. And you got to remember too that, like, back in the newsprint days, newsstrip days, these guys, so some of these big time funny papers dudes, they were celebrities, like national celebrities, right? In looking at Hogan's Alley and looking at oh my God,
Windsor McKay. You're talking
Windsor McKay. That's what I was trying to think of. Yeah.
Walt Kniff, maybe.
Yeah, definitely.
Or not Walt. It's whatever. I forget his first name. Milton. Yeah. Kniff, yeah.
Milton Kniff.
Foster with Prince Valiant.
Yeah, I'm totally spaced on the dude's name who did Crazy Cat.
Oh crap.
Yeah.
Harriman.
Yeah, right. So these guys became like national celebrities. They were the top of the game. They were raking it in. But it still was a situation where it was going out to the masses, but the amount that the invention of funny books just like took that to a whole different framework. And I would think a lot of that has to do with the invention with the subsequent invention of superheroes too, right? And the idea that you
so the dates. So in terms of a metal, setting up some dates here, we're looking for antediluvian. You're looking at 1933 and 1934 because you've got Max Gaines and basically the first kind of like giveaway comic books, I think, in 1933, and then in 1934 it was like Famous Funnies, which is reprints of Sunday strips in a tableau format, which is like we're gonna try selling this. We're gonna try this thing that we invented, because when we gave it away, it was kind of popular. The kids and such liked it. So let's try selling it and stapling it together. And then, so like those are your antediluvian or part of your precursor, right? And then you could, if you want to go full antediluvian, you could go all the way back to the precursors of just the Hogan's Alley and Yellow Kid, Those are your other big benchmarks, unless you want to go all the way into like Rodolphe Topher's early experiments.
I think Rodolphe Topher's like definitely the origin of comics as a medium, but they're still not looking at the separation of the language of comics. Didn't really, I would think what really kicked it off was like the invention of the word balloon, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that happened in the pages of Hogan's Alley and the Yellow Kid. And
the comic strip is you've got a couple other like precursor prehistoric signposts, unless you're going full McCloud. But
I think that's also a really good line, no matter where you're looking, right? Like even if you look at Japanese comics, you could argue that the first manga goes all the way back to like 1803, where they actually were doing sequential art. But until they start seeing American word balloons and how the panels are divided, it doesn't look like what we know comics or even manga to look like today.
You guys are making R.C. Harvey really happy. This is how he defines comics, by the way.
Do we or do we not have to take into account when the actual word starts being used?
When the what?
Get cut off.
Do we have to take into account when the word comic, as in comedic, starts being used to define these comics?
It starts with the funny pages in the newspapers, and then they basically put that together and stapled it in 1933 and said comic book.
Yeah, the comics were used for political comics, and back in the 1800s still. So I mean, we've got the name comic has been used and cartoon and comics were used interchangeably for quite a while.
So that's kind of like those are some of the initial. Sorry, go ahead, Punch.
I was just gonna say, at this rate, I was worried because I have to duck out to get my mom when her shuttle arrives in town here, and it's in about 20 minutes. I was afraid I was going to miss the whole show, but at this rate, I think you'll still be on the golden age when I get back. So this will be be good.
It's certainly a possibility.
And I
we'll
thought
definitely,
this was going to
we'll
be
definitely
a short
pick
thing.
up. Yeah, we'll definitely pick up at a certain point. But if you, those are those. So if you want to start things, we're gonna have to go way back. That's on that timeline.
Okay, here's the real question: if we're calling this antediluvian, is there an Adam and Eve?
It's Jammer Kids.
It's Topher.
Yeah, Topher is the actual origin.
It's Rodolphe Topher, unless you're doing McCloud, in which case it's cave paintings,
hieroglyphs, it's cave paintings, and no, I mean, there were sequential like paintings actually done, but I don't.
Part of like this beginning thing is like it also, this conversation also basically deals not just with historicity or history, but it also deals with a little bit. At least it overlaps with the conversation about the definition of your personal definition of comics a little bit.
Well, that's why I was thinking about the name.
Well,
how
honestly, I
would
think
have been named after comedy.
I think if we're talking about superhero comics, which is usually what we tend to talk about, then the useful dates to paint on the timeline here without getting too pedantic about it is 1933 and 34.
Right.
Because that's basically the birth of the comic book. And if you want to keep going further, you can and go into the comic strips, but that's really kind of a separate affair. And after Action Comics #1 in 1938, that's when things really kick off for at least the superhero genre. And that's really where the dating system that we talk about, golden age. That's really when fans use the system, that age system, and they mention golden age, that's what they're talking about. They started golden age 1938 Action Comics #1.
In that case, perhaps I'm looking at this wrong, and instead of figuring out when we started using the word comics, we should actually be thinking about when we stopped using it exclusively to refer to comedy and started looking at it as simply the medium.
That was also pretty early, because
again, you're still looking at. I think you're still looking at essentially the same time frame, which is 1933 to 34.
Yeah. Because like comics, like editorial comics, that that existed at the time, like before they were necessarily sequential. Like editorial comics in the 1800s use a lot of the same kind of time bendiness that comics are known to do. but even though they're single panels, they still use a lot of the same kind of time bendiness. But they were called cartoons or comics interchangeably. So the jump from the time bendy single panel satirical caricature to the full on strip took place gradually from Topher through to the newspaper strips. So and all that time you got them being called comics and cartoons interchangeably. So that's and you know the
term I'm familiar with is funny pages, which is like again what they call the Sunday funnies, and then when they bundle that together, that's when they call it a comic book, because it's a booklet of the comic strips. Because they used to be, again, they were comic strips because they were those panels in strip form. And that's kind of like, we should move on from that point. If you could share my screen for 1 second, I also wanted to throw another monkey wrench into the conversation, which is, and I thought this was really fascinating. This is one of the other problems with the Ages system. You can see on the left here is the fact that the big two, and superheroes used to be much bigger, you know, like Archie Comics did it, a whole bunch of others did it early on. But the big two kind of have a stake in the Ages system, and DC especially, because they were kind of one of the first ones on the scene.
Can we at least call it the big three and include action?
But the situation is the fact that goodness gracious, derailing me. Is you have DC, for example, they have on their website under DC Universe here, you can see they have their own age system. And again, you'll see Golden and Silver, and that's again fairly uncontested. But then they split it up into Bronze, Modern, New 52, and Rebirth. And you'll notice that a couple of their time frames there are actually all of them, all of their comics ages are pretty centered around their comics. Whereas, you know,
specifically they're centered around Superman, because that's how they age their crossovers. Like, oh, this is Golden Age Superman who's coming back and fighting Bronze Age
Silver Age always starts with Flash. Silver Age always starts with New Flash for DC.
But like the reason they're invested in their grade though is how they use their characters in other things. Because they will bring back old Superman, old Flash, and stuff like that.
And that's a good point, actually, is that for DC, since the Bronze Age, pretty much their ages can be defined almost exclusively as when did they have another reboot.
It's not. It really isn't about reboot. It's not really about necessarily the reboot.
Because every so often it's going to happen. You're going to get another one of those major crossover events, and then that will ultimately lead to them.
That's a new thing. That's a relatively new thing, because the Bronze Age here is not dated around, like, I think Crisis of Infinite Earths. New 52 and Rebirth are. So
the modern age really should be called post-crisis, because it's not modern. It's a decade ago.
Yeah.
Well, Hutch, if I could interject there, modern doesn't necessarily mean contemporary. Modern and modernism, like there's some other like artistic things you could. I don't necessarily think that their version of modern necessarily patterns on modernism, by the way, but like there is a there was a modernist period of literature, and it didn't necessarily mean it's contemporary. We've moved well past it,
Well, I mean, I was going to say, I'm just glad they didn't call it modern, postmodern, and postmodern.
Postmodern, right? So the main point I wanted to just, like, before we move on, I just wanted to say that DC has, on their website, they have a list of what they consider the ages to be, but after you get past the first two that are very accepted, it really starts to just kind of get very contestable, which leads us to where we are today, which is the fact that apart from Golden and Silver, there is no unified, accepted by all fans and scholars ages system. If you pick up 3 or 4 books, you'll get 3 or 4 opinions and 3 or 4 different labels. They'll all start with Golden and Silver, but then the book I've got here by Peter Coogan says Antediluvian, which is like precursors, Golden, Silver, Bronze, Iron, and then Renaissance, which is really bizarre if you think about like what he's channeling for the. It gets really complicated when he starts to pick apart that concept. And then I think Grant Morrison kind of painted it really broadly when he said Golden, Silver, and then kind of like things got darker, so like darker age. He's painting really broad categories. So creators, scholars, fans are all part of this conversation, and they will all draw the lines in different places. And the companies who are part of this conversation as well have a vested interest in painting those lines in ways that put them at the signpost points. Because a DC can say, well, this whole age is defined by this issue where Superman did X or Flash did Y, then they get a way more control over the history of comics. The Silver Age for, of course, Marvel starts with, like, I think Fantastic Four #1, right? That's kind of the So they would have their own dating system, and it's that's what I think makes this conversation very interesting, is because of those factors that are interacting with, and arguing with each other, and having sometimes a financial stake in how the history is presented to the public. Okay, I'll shut up.
So the main takeaway for now is, if you're going to put up the timeline, just start with bronze and silver, and we'll move on.
Golden and silver, right? Is the one you want to start with. Yeah, you want to start with gold, silver.
Gold and silver, sorry.
Because I that's the thing I think is interesting, is because, like, the debates I think really start like post silver. Although Marvel and DC, I think, both have a stake in what they think where the Silver Age would start for them, right? Because you have New Flash starts the Silver Age, by pretty much everyone agrees on that, and then you've got like I said, Fantastic Four. So I think New Flash is 1956. When's Fantastic Four #1? I'm not. Anybody?
I can't recall off my head.
Okay. I would say that the Captain Comet and Martian Manhunter precede the Flash, but yeah, I mean, I'm comfortable with Barry Allen being the real start of the Silver Age.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would lobby toward Martian Manhunter just because of its cross genre appeal. Right, it really brought that superhero-y out in a new way.
I'm fine with saying that they didn't make such an impact that everybody goes, that's the Silver Age. So by that definition alone, you could say they're precursors. They're kind of leading the way, but they're kind of like the guys who first broke the sound barriers, but they didn't land on the moon. Everybody knows when we landed on the moon,
Well, that's the thing about ages, right? Like, even when we talk about actual historical ages, it's like there's no exact year that the medieval period starts. Right? But there's an approximate time that we agreed upon. Usually we'll use like one of the more rounded years, like a figure of 10, to be like, yes, this period started just about this time, because this is when things started unfolding in the culture of this time.
What if I might...
Fantastic Four #1 is 1961. So if you're dating that, there's actually a 5-year kind of gap between when Silver Age starts for either of those companies, if you're using those. So
I might bring up an unusual and perhaps controversial way of looking at it, but might I suggest that a really easy way to look at the Golden Age is to say that it is a time period where out of the classic Justice League, only the main Trinity, Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman, would still be recognizable to a non-comic reader.
So, run that by me again.
So, if you look at how existences, appearances, etc., have changed over time, in the Golden Age, only the main, the three biggest in DC, Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, would still be recognized to most non or casual comic book readers who are not, deep into the history of comics at this point. Nobody, I shouldn't say nobody. There's a ton of people out there who, if you showed them a picture of the original Flash, they would go, "Who the heck is that?"
Mm-hmm.
Right?
They're only up until the late 90s, early 2000s. There were 5 characters that had been in consistent publication since the Golden Age: Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, Aquaman, and Green Arrow. Then they killed Green Arrow. and then they killed Aquaman. But yeah,
Anyway, just a thought.
They're all walking corpses.
So to kind of like ping off your
That's
point
amazing.
a little bit, I would add to the fact that one thing that this that's that someone's phone's ringing.
It's not mine.
It sounded like a landline. But I would say that I'm trying to pull up a couple images here. I got this. I'll just pull this up on a PowerPoint. So one thing I do want to point out that I think speaks to the necessity, or at least the not longevity, the relevance, I guess, of some of these ages conversations, is the fact that it's very, very clear when you look at, and this is something that we don't always talk about, but artistically, there are differences. And I'm going to pull up a slide I'd like to share. Just give me 1 second.
Especially when you average it to like
I've got a
house
slide
styles,
that
you can
basically
definitely-
shows. All right, here we go. Yeah, exactly. So like you can see a difference. 1 second, let me pull this up. Window, and I want this thing. Okay.
Yeah, I can swap you over.
Okay, good.
Okay, so on the left
I
we've
have
got
my power.
Simon and Kirby we have Simon and Kirby displaying Captain America's origins in 1940 right here, and then we've got on the right we've got Lee and Kirby basically portraying the exact same thing in 1969. And you can clearly tell. So it's two different writers, but you have the exact same artist, and he is portraying both of these characters, or sorry, he's portraying the same character very, very differently. One of them is just even the paneling, the narration, the artwork, the shading, the line, just all of the details of it. Same artist, very clearly Golden Age. And on the right, you have very clearly Silver Age. So that's one thing I did want to point out as being, one of the reasons why people talk about the ages and why it is important to discuss is the fact that there's something very observably different. You know, if you look at how the musculature on Steve Rogers in those two panels, and you see how one of them is using just like that heavy shaded effect on the muscles, and on the right you just have like the much heavier instead of cross hatching, you just have like heavy
instead
ink.
of hatching, we've got more spotting. Yeah.
Right, which makes the character look has a very it creates a very distinct look. You also have a more rudimentary action scenes. Again, same. This is Jack Kirby both times, but in the Golden Age, things are much more static,
structured.
You know, the storytelling isn't as action focused. Whereas the next time he tells it, it's like, you know, we have all of the motion lines, all of the focus on, you know, those, you know, explosive action panels. So like I said, this is the difference between Golden Age, Silver Age, and that's one of the reasons why this kind of discussion is important.
A focus on form to a focus on action, like what the form is doing instead of like actually rendering the form out.
Well, and this is all going to be important later on too, because at certain times you're going to have, just a few people, or even sometimes one, like let's say Liefeld, who will be part of or even start, responsible for a major artistic movement, even within an age.
Mm-hmm. I was amazed how I couldn't take my eyes off that one on the right. The one on the left is so staid, and the one on the right is like every panel is action. Even when he's just standing there going, I'm big. It's like there's radiant lines coming off the back of him. His clothes are ripped up. It's like, and he's looking down at himself, and it's just, I've grown. And it's like, compared to the way that guy's just standing there like, now I have muscles. It's just wow.
And what's funny is how the Silver Age is known for, being this goofy, we really didn't care era. But I think we're kind of seeing where that may have only been part of the equation there.
Okay, so because it took me a while to get my timeline up, since we were originally going to be using Reese's, did we pick when the Golden Age started?
Well, And I'm all
30,
for.
just
That's
about.
right.
Okay.
I was saying I'm all for looking like a wider lens back to like 1893. At looking at the growth and explosion of the newspaper strip and how important that was to the development of the comic book. I think that we need to note that there is a significant amount of genre building, of developing those tools, and defining the language and intuiting the language of comics from 93 up until the development to Gaines invented the comic book in 33.
So you're right, but
Well, if we're doing Golden Age, I think Golden Age starts in 30. I think Golden Age starts in 38. If you're doing pre
38? Okay, we can do 38 then.
Okay.
If you want to do antediluvian, we could start separating that because like the birth of the comic book is like
Right.
1933, 1934. Then you've got, a few years of them just kind of Eisner and company setting up just comic book shops and just making, comic funny content. And then you got the detective, the pulp strips essentially, and all the rest of that. And then Action Comics 1 happens, and that's basically Golden Age of superheroes. There's obviously, again, there's some precursor stuff to that too, but it's really Action Comics #1 that kicks off the Golden Age. That one's pretty universal.
well, and the thing is that both Golden and Silver are kind of synonymous with being about superheroes. So what you might need is in between the antediluvian and Golden Age is something like a Platinum Age, to refer to all those kinds of classic heroes like the Shadow and Dick Tracy, everything that came that was basically superheroes before superheroes actually existed.
Tarzan, I think, is the other big one.
The pulp age.
Yeah,
Spirits.
The one thing about it is like the Spirits after.
Yeah, Spirit's a little.
Spirits
He's-
definitely a Golden Age
He's
creation.
post
Okay.
superhero.
Yeah.
But yeah, you get the idea, right?
Yeah, but I mean, like,
Mhm.
and the Shadow existed outside of comics first. He was created for the radio and then incorporated into the pulps, and then was later adapted into comics.
Well, still though, but I mean, it's
So that was
when
one of
he's-
those things. Same thing with like the Green Hornet, right? Was created for radio first, and then for the comics.
Nevertheless, we're
Orphan-
talking about
Little
when they
Orphan
were
Annie,
prevalent in comics.
Little Orphan Annie, that definitely is has its home in the new strip, Popeye, and the success that Popeye was and took over
Okay.
the Thimble Theater.
Yeah.
And then like I said, and as previously mentioned, Crazy Cat. So if I was to say a Platinum Age, I would think that it would actually, like I said, be from the newspaper wars in 1893 up through the invention of the comic book in 33. And I think
Let's
that
say-
you have
Let's say we call it the pulp age.
Pulp's
I would
more of a
go-
genre. Pulp's more of
yeah,
a
pulp
genre.
age.
I
Alright,
think.
alright.
And
you're
And even
running
then,
the
it's
problem.
also kind of more of a medium, and then it becomes a genre when you're talking about
yeah,
comics.
and pulps
specifically.
aren't comics. That's the other
Yeah.
thing
Right,
about it.
right, and you run into because like you with that terminology, you run into the problems of effacing all of the comic strips that basically gave
Yeah.
birth to the first comic book, which then led to So
So do we
Okay.
want to add an age before the Golden Age?
Yeah.
One.
I can see how you might kind of need it.
So my opinion
Okay, what are we calling
is,
this age then?
is I say we have the Platinum Age from 1893 to 1933.
I like that too. Platinum instead of antediluvian.
And then I honestly
Well, no, I'm
think
saying platinum comes in between.
I think Platinum comes
Or
before.
whatever.
I think Platinum comes. I think Antediluvian is an appropriate title for that period from Gaines to Superman, because
what was
Superman
the,
was such a flood.
Second year, we're
Uh-huh.
going right to when the Golden starts, or the end
So,
year for Platinum?
So the Platinum 33.
There we go.
Okay.
That's how I say.
I should excuse me. I should probably duck out for a few minutes. Got to go pick up my mother from the shuttle, and I'll be back. Just the only thing I have to say is that I am for 1956 being the hard start of the Silver Age. I know that Fantastic Four may come 5 years later, and that just means Marvel came out. But you're not going to say that those 5 years of comics that DC was doing don't count because we don't want to go with DC over Marvel. It's like,
So I'm
sorry,
I'm actually
I would say
100% with you on there
56
because it wasn't just. I mean, it wasn't just the stuff that was going on at Marvel that was changing. I mean, like Dell was becoming a huge powerhouse, and I mean they had been before, but they were continuing a domination of different markets. Anyway, we'll talk.
I'll be back.
Yeah.
I'll be back.
Good luck.
Thanks.
Good luck.
Safety and travels to Hutch out there on the world. The world is a wild and cruel place.
So, like I said, this is actually where the fewest debates end up being, and the conversation ends up being mostly concurrence with I mostly can see that. There's not a whole lot of debate around that point. Fans, scholars, even the big industry people, like Marvel's not going to ignore that DC had a Silver Age and that theirs started with Flash. It's just interesting because both of them would have, like I said, they both have a financial stake in where their history relates and maps onto this. And it gets what's interesting is if we think back to the list that I showed, it gets stickier and more problematic as it goes.
Mm-hmm.
The further back in time it is, the more like solidified it is, which outlines a principle here about when it comes to talking about these ages, you really need the benefit of a lot of hindsight before that time frame really starts to solidify and people can really agree on it.
Oh, absolutely. But that's just how history works, right?
Sure.
But since this is the least contentious, where are we ending the Golden Age?
Okay, I believe the Golden Age, and I will actually show a slide to demonstrate this. I believe the Golden Age is dead by 1952. And let me share my screen to demonstrate what I mean by that.
Okay.
So
the scholarship some of the scholarship I've read, so the one I'm pulling from is Peter Coogan. He puts it at Plastic Man number 64 in 1956, which is also kind of like the turnaround to New Flash and the Silver Age. So he puts them basically right, like
back to back. Okay, we could do that, but if you.
But at that point, with what Reese is saying, like you're dealing with like it's still in the 1950s, give or take a few years. So it's that's not a huge.
Since you have the ability,
I'm fine with gray areas between ages, like gaps.
I was going to say, since you have the ability to control these, to drag and shorten these timelines as much as you want, why don't we include crossover?
Well, and here's my reasoning for it, right?
Hit us with the graph.
Right. So, in 1951, like, DC, Fawcett basically stopped fighting a decades-long series of legal disputes with DC over Captain Marvel and shuttered their comic business, right? And pulled themselves out of the comic things and their whole comic distribution wing too. So that like stopped existing, the comics distribution wing. Another thing that happened is in 52, there was a huge market bubble that popped, and like comics went from releasing and selling, like I can't remember the exact numbers right now. Let me just go back to the screen so I can read it. Thousands of units on the weekly, over 3,000 units on the weekly, and then within a year had lost like $1,000 units of their weekly market share, and just free falled for years, and with that, we ended up having, this is a circulation numbers, demonstrating that like while there was precipitous people that were still making comics, a lot of your small companies like the Lev Gleason Group were just consistently dwindling. EC Comics was in that number too, and of course EC couldn't get distribution because of the whole comics code thing. But that happened in 54. But they were already running down on numbers before that, and the market was contracting precipitously. And so one of the things that we ended up having is like the golden age as far as being the market boom was done. And so while they're still making books, while the comic industry as such is still making books, and a lot of them are what we consider quality books, you still are going to be looking at this dithering market. And even in and there was a decrease in the late 40s in the number of superhero titles that were being published. And as Jim Tuner in the chat points out, the golden age, JSA and All-Star Comics stopped publishing in 51. But even with that, you're still looking at the fact that other genres, romance and horror or true crime and even history books that were being published were still keeping the market afloat until the bubble starts popping. And so a lot of smaller companies that had more niche fan bases, they just weren't able to stay afloat. And then of course you've got the shenanigans of the distribution markets. And
this is interesting. But I do need to point out a couple of I think you have a point. So I have to acknowledge the point you're making here, but there is a bit of a categorization, what I call a conflation happening here.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you say, once we start saying romance and the rest, we are now putting other genres in with the superhero genre.
Right.
And then when we say golden age of comics, we're again back to those problems of separation, where when we usually use those ages systems, we're usually talking about the superhero genre specifically. And so you almost need two time frames or two dating systems to talk about American comics as a whole and the superhero genre. Most people are talking about the superhero genre. So I personally do want to keep those things separate. And the second point I want to bring up real fast is the fact that this is an excellent model and graph for detailing, if we talk about golden age as this was my golden age of my crop or the golden age of my business, which maps very well. However, there is this highlights a big difference between how other people may approach the ages system, which is more based on the aesthetics. I don't know. Before you stepped away, I showed two panels, one from Golden Age Captain America and one from Silver Age Captain America. And and the point there wasn't about sales or the golden age of when this sold the top. The point there was the stylistic and aesthetic differences that became emblematic of what that age represented in the content and in the form. And so, for example, Peter Coogan, the guy who I've been channeling here and referencing,
his stuff's solid. So
yeah, and his ages system that he's using is on the aesthetics much more than it's based on the sales. So so when you say the golden age of the comic book industry in America peaked in 52 around 52, right? And then precipitously declined, and there was no longer that golden age of comic books in America. That's a true statement. But I would caution and say we can't conflate all of that with a dating system that we're basically talking about superheroes with, because that runs into that's a conflation.
Well, the question I think is, are there ages that are more defined by genre than others? There may be some ages where all kinds of stuff is happening, and others where it's just like that one thing.
Well, post comics code, it becomes completely defined, almost by superheroes, and then at post Dell collapse, it's then just superheroes all the way out.
Yeah, and the Dell collapse was much later. But and the other thing, I mean, that's definitely a part of the thing. But the other side of it is that the age system as we use it, the timing and the framing and the description of it was created by superhero fans, right? So there is already going to be a
bias
that's built into that. Because it's written by superhero fans. And part of my point in mentioning, and I didn't have all of because some of the stuff was prepared before, but some of the stuff that is like the superheroes, if you're looking at sales, superheroes were already on the decline before 1950. You couldn't just, there were already the people that were the not as a whole, But like one of the things that happened from the late 30s through the early 40s was there's this glut of new heroes and new spandex, and no idea was too crazy, and everyone was out there doing something. And you had a real wheat versus chaff happening in the middle 50s after the war.
There's a big, I was gonna say there's a big dip in superheroes after the war, because the superhero role of representing, flags on chest and we're beating our enemies overseas, then all the rebellious kids grow up and they don't need that anymore. Instead, what they want is crime and horror, which then gets slapped. The thing that saves, which is funny because I know we've talked about Comics Code. There's a lot of debate about Comics Code, but if you're a superhero fan, you are also partially a fan of the Comics Code, because by most people's, I think, recollection, the code saved the superheroes because they were about to get eaten alive by the gangsters and the vampires.
And even that's an exaggeration, because the gangsters and the vampires didn't move the sale numbers. Like even without the code, Gleason only had maybe another year to go. I mean, like there's and EC they got screwed. EC got because like American periodical distributors were found to be part of a mafia money laundering scheme, and they entirely were dissolved. Dell wouldn't distribute anyone that wasn't Dell. Fawcett wasn't distributing comics, and National was one of the only shows in town, and they weren't going to work with DC with EC for sure. So
they also formed the code in a way to literally eliminate words out of EC's marketing. So it was like, you can't use the word terror anywhere, and it's like, well, there goes Vault of Terror. And
the thing that gets me mad about that is within within like 6 months of EC going under, DC releases House of Secrets, which is a horror title. Marvel had Amazing Fantasy, which was a horror title. They just didn't call it that. They called them mystery books.
I still think it's fairly accepted that the Comics Code and the downplaying of crime and horror sparked a lot more. Okay, well, we're doing superheroes again. So whether or not sales was a part of that, it definitely got into the consciousness of the creators. And a lot of them left comics at that point, and the ones that stayed were like, all right, well, we're doing stuff with Batman.
Dave's got a real interesting point in the chat, something that I hadn't thought of. A U.S. government advertising for war bonds fell after World War II. That would have been a big advertising source for comics, and definitely could have led people to artificially inflate the number of books that were going out to get that ad money that just stopped showing up so much after the war. That's a really interesting observation, Dave. I never would have thought about that. So that's clever. That's the way to, yeah. Oh, and also going back to the chat on the stuff before comic books, Blondie by Chick Young is amazing stuff, and everybody should read more Blondie, especially the old Blondie.
What
Back
about
when it was a drama strip and not really a comedy one?
It morphed pretty quickly into a comedy one, but the even in the drama, it's just there's a purity in it that's just, well, not necessarily.
You used to focus on Blondie. You used to be about her, and she's like, I'm a girl in the city. I'm gonna fall in love, and there's the rapes, and it was like, it's just
talking just after that when you have when it's not Blondie the Flapper, when it's just Blondie after Dagwood shows up. That Dagwood's character is just hilarious. Anyway, moving on. So let's go to our list. We've had our little argument there. Let's go back to the.
So did we decide between 52 and 56 between the argument?
I think you can kind of like make that a range, because we
could. That could be
Reese has a point about. Yeah, Reese has a point regarding the entire industry. I think if we're talking about superheroes, I think,
and it's worth noting the longevity and staying power of Plastic Man within the framework of Golden Age books. I think that's a really solid argument, but I'm not sure you could prolong an entire age for one character that happens to be a holdout of something.
Well, like I was saying, this is where you may want to just have some overlapping areas.
Right? Yeah, overlap or gray areas, because again, part of it is about, it's not just sales, it's content. right? It's about like what the attitude and the art style and what they're doing with the books, right?
And so that's actually
so-
really interesting, because if 52 represents that in a new way of thinking about comics, then it brings a whole lot more meaning to DC's new 52 later on.
I had never thought about that
Inadvertently.
before.
Yeah.
I hadn't until you said 52.
Jim has an interesting comment. You could also take the end of the Golden Age as the appearance of Captain America's Weird Tales in 49. That's also an interesting perspective. I like that. I do like that. He also said previously superhero comics died during the Korean War, which that's definitely in the space about all of that.
Well, I was going to bring up how also the big, probably the idea of superheroes and comics differed coming out of the 50s, because back during the war, everything was about getting this, big, powerful hero to save us from that big, evil empire across the seas who could only be stopped seemingly with something as, equally as powerful as an atomic bomb. In the 60s, this is going to completely change to where the ultimate hero is the spy, saving us from something that is completely invisible. You can't fight this with tanks and superpowers, right? You have to actually outthink your enemy.
Not in the comics. In the comics, you just had commie smashers, and it was Iron Man.
Yeah.
You have Iron Man and Captain America just doing nothing but commie smashing with.
Well, and
spies happen, but it's.
But I'm saying, is that
even Spy Smasher over in.
Is that perhaps
Smasher
part of
funny
why
is,
superheroes died during the Korean War?
Spies
Because
were
they
actually
were no
more
longer...
potent in the late 30s, early 40s of comics because of World War II. Like you saw a lot of like below street level hero type characters that were just straight up like spies and counter spies and stuff like that. Like Black Ace, for example.
One thing I do want to point out is that when it comes to the role that superheroes had in war, it was actually very interesting, because going back to the picture of that everyone remembers of Captain America punching Hitler, that doesn't actually happen in the comic.
Right.
It never does. And so they would occasionally put like a cover or maybe a promotional kind of image with that sort of thing. And I distinctly remembered this story that Superman grabbed Hitler and Stalin and brought them before the United Nations or something. That's not a DC comic. It was a story. I think it might've been by Siegel, but it was for a magazine. The official line with these companies were that the superheroes definitely represented a patriotic spirit. And when they sold bonds, there's a Batman Bond advertisement of slap a Jap, and there's Batman on the front or something. That. So they would use it for advertising and such. But Batman does not go overseas and fight the Nazis. Over here, he fought I think maybe some saboteurs here and there. Mostly, he stays out of the war. Superman does not. They're on the fringes of it. But the idea that Superman actually went and fought in World War II doesn't happen in the comics.
Well, he certainly did in the cartoons, I can tell you that, though.
Kind of a little, but they would often keep him on the fringes. So in the Fleischer cartoon, the one I think that was really obvious, Jungle Drums, he doesn't go to Europe. It's an island, made up nation, and there's a German there, and he defeats the German. But it's very clearly not he's not with the GI Joes. And
but I remember one where he was literally they just kept showing this shot from far away, and you were seeing the explosions as it was being implied that he was destroying another tank after another, literally right over there in Japan.
Well, the problem is that would be very much.
I also remember the one where a Japanese spy tried to steal a plane. He had to stop it.
Yeah, I think there's some of that. But if I remember the cartoons, those are events that are happening on U.S. soil.
Right, a lot of that is on the fringes. He does not go to the front lines.
So it's
that one
people that are
fighting a war.
The explosions. That's definitely what was happening.
You might. because the one I remember the Jungle Drums
cow.
one. It has to do with submarine secrets, and it's Superman does not sink the subs. He passes the information along, and then
No, I don't
the
even know that
Navy
one.
sinks the subs. But like it's usually Superman on the fringes of so the broader point I'm trying to make here is that the superheroes of the Golden Age got a reputation of often participating in the war when they really didn't, because I think there may have been some, like, we don't want to take away from the heroism of the GIs who are fighting over there, and we also don't want to make it look like we don't want to like sell a false narrative of tomorrow Superman's going to end the war, when in fact it's going to take another 2 years of slogging effort.
Right.
So you know, so they didn't want to like have those types of problems. So it's just interesting because like when people often talk about the Golden Age, they just think of the fact that, oh, Captain America fought he fought the Nazis over in Germany, and it's like, well, you know, he did not actually punch Hitler. That was just that was a promotional, idealistic image.
Right.
Well,
But you'd be forgiven for thinking that, because boy, did they put those covers on every single time.
Right. Well,
Sure.
and they also, when you look at like, you know, stuff in the 70s with Roy Thomas's Invaders, they do reinterpret some of those Golden Age stories as happening across the sea, and incorporating then in Marvel comics, like Sergeant Fury and his Howling Commandos are set in the front, in the European front, and so then you have the 70s comics that then are retrojecting superhero history into the same world that Sergeant Fury is existing in. So you definitely have some retrojections that have that, but to Atlas's point, in the actual contemporaneous Golden Age, those are limited to the covers.
What about Namor, since he was specifically set to be in the Pacific?
No, he's actually not. He's in the southern Atlantic, off the coast of Antarctica.
So everything with Marvel centers around New York. It is everything.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter where you are, you end up in New York.
Because that's the thing, right? So unless you were a comic that was specifically set on the front, people mostly just did not interact with the front. Like they were back home and doing stuff.
A couple examples: Namor and also Aquaman had situations where they were dealing with Nazis on the seas in international waters, and so that once again is not actually on the front. It's you know, away from there. So it's still they
would purposely try to avoid certain like frontline kind of usages. I'm not saying it never ever happened. I'm just saying that you could tell, like, it was very definitely observable that there was an avoidance towards some of that specific Pacific. All right, I think we can definitely move into our Silver Age type stuff. We'll never get through any of this.
So
I think we're starting in 56, right?
56, yeah. Well, I wouldn't say Namor was a villain in the Golden Age. He just wasn't the typical hero.
He was a very odd character. He still is.
Yeah, still is. It was definitely, I think, more of an anti-hero, because his perspective was so far removed from that he actually was a contrary voice.
Right.
But it wasn't necessarily the same as a villain per se. In the same way that if you had, I can't think of another example, Black Widow.
Well, I was going to say he could actually get away with doing the stuff that they wanted to trick you into thinking Superman was going to do.
Yeah, I think that's an argument. Fizz is voting for 54 as the start of the Golden Age, which I believe is the introduction of the Martian Manhunter. But as our previous conversation, I do think that we're looking at the surge of popularity around the Flash and those then the Green Lantern and the return of Hawkman, and that kind of thing that actually made Marvel sit up and take notice. I think so. I think that's a big factor in all of that.
Can we put a mark on 61 for being when Marvel kind of like enters the Silver Age?
Yeah, I think you could
Yeah, I could
actually,
put
because
individual
Marvel
papers
changes
if
the
you
game so much, and I don't think anybody can argue that they didn't, right?
Yeah.
It took a while for DC to start playing the same game, and I think that may have been something of a mistake because instead of adding to their toolbox, they tried replacing it in some way.
Right.
But anyway, but with the point, I think you can really make an argument for a Marvel age within the Silver Age. That is a separate moment in comics time. What do you guys think about that?
Well, I was going to say, I wonder if there are 2, possibly even 3 sections of the Silver Age, because, like I was saying, a lot of people may just think of the campy Adam West style of things, which was definitely a thing. But at the exact same time, Marvel is over there doing like nearly the opposite in terms of seriousness. So,
Well, the
But
Adam
even in the
West,
past, any individual event you want me to tag on the timeline, I can go back and tag them.
right. We have that unusual era of DC trying to copy Marvel. It's almost like we could probably split this into a beginning, middle, and end age.
So the Fizz brings up an interesting point because camp was used by both Marvel and DC, but I think in different ways. I believe Stan Lee basically kind of phrased it in terms of Marvel's approach was hip campiness. And so it was this sort of campiness that teenagers could kind of wink at and be like, hey, this is kind of campy, but it's cool. And that was exactly the attitude they channeled. Whereas in DC, they ended up going for as Cartoonicus is mentioning, they went for the Adam West goofy camp.
Yeah, goofy like your dad is.
Yeah.
Right, but even that wasn't really a decision to be made, that was made until 66 to match with the TV show. The camp that DC uses is I think literally because it was being written by middle-aged dads.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
it's like a natural culture that just kind of came about.
So
yeah, and I mean,
so we just have to define the entirety of the Silver Age as DC copies Marvel.
No.
I mean,
they're doing different.
Marvel, I mean,
if anything, I would say it's they're both channeling campiness and sci-fi. It's
Yeah, but I would say in some ways this era is the one where they're the most distinctly different from each other throughout their entirety.
Well, yeah, let me reiterate that DC copies Marvel and fails.
Well, no, because I mean, we're looking at if we're looking at 56 and the superhero renaissance that is going on over at DC, the Seven Soldiers of Victory and the Earth 1, Earth 2, and the Legion of Superheroes and Flash and the new Green Lantern with the Guardians and all that stuff, and the Thanagarian Hawks, the reinvention of the Hawks as alien space cops. Then I mean that was all happening before 61. That was all happening when Marvel was basically just throwing stuff at the wall and really doubling down on trying to make something different happen. And they were doing the horror, not horror, and they were doing the Twilight Zones type of stories, and they were doing the westerns, and they were doing just kind of anything that they could make work to try to keep things going. And they were doing, I think Captain America was as a commie smasher was being published at the time too. But I mean, it was nothing was hitting cylinders for them until Fantastic Four #1. And
I'm a little fuzzy on some of it, but but I have done a little reading on this, and I remember reading a chunk of this was of some of the campiness of some of that early Silver Age. You had Mort Weisinger running a chunk of that show, and I'm trying to remember some of his approach. They started bringing in a soap opera aspect, especially to Superman. And I remember Superman in the 60s was a very interesting read because he was kissing somebody every issue. It was always like this bevy of a parade of women that he was just macking out with.
Right.
So there was definitely some experiments, and not all of it was just silly. Some of it was we're experimenting with melodrama. Some of it is we're gonna try. This is the 50s and 60s. There's a lot of scientific advancements happening, a lot of cultural and technological advancements happening, and this is around the time where Stan Lee is just using radiation to stand in for magic, and in DC that it's let's put a city in a bottle. So there's a lot of just and these things end up becoming sometimes beloved parts of superhero lore, but there's a lot of just
throwing
crazy
spaghetti at the wall and seeing if it sticks.
yeah.
Yeah.
So
well, and I mean, and like a lot of these guys that were Weisinger and with like Otto
Binder, I think
guys were guys that were over at DC. They were like golden age. They were like the cream of the golden age crop that had left comics for a while to write in science fiction mags and all that kind of stuff. And then they came back around when there started being when DC started making money again.
Mort was also apparently known for being quite the tyrant, and guess who he trained?
Oh, Jim Shooter.
So some of that whole Jim Shooter was a tyrant at the office. It was like, well, Jim Shooter was almost raised from 14 years old by Mort Weisinger, who showed him how to run the entire business from writing to the printing press, and then apparently imparted some of his management style.
But you know what?
It's
never
probably
happened?
For the best.
Books were coming out on time. So, and and one of the other things that I'm really I want to dig into a little more when we have our deep dive into romance comics as a genre, but like some of the Superman, with his crazy kissings, we're in Superman's Girlfriend Lois Lane, which was a romance book, right, for a lot of it. So a lot of that Lois and Lana love triangle nonsense was was a factor in that. There were this sort of not middle age, silver age genre creep. This Jim Tooner shares this story. This is amazing. Roy Thomas worked for Mort Weisinger for 1 week in the 60s before moving to Marvel. He hated it. I remember him I had forgotten about that story. I remember him talking about it, I think on Fraga's channel a couple years ago. He drove all the way back to Indiana or wherever he was living and was like, well, that was comics for me, I guess.
Can't take the heat. Roy also brings up Jim Tooner brings up an interesting point by saying that au contraire to Marvel being DC copying Marvel started partially because of Stan Lee being told to copy the Justice League. So hey, they have a team book. We need a team book. Do it tomorrow. And Stan Lee goes, okay.
I mean, this is just indicative of exactly what we see nowadays with every big company trying to copy each other all the time.
Right? No, yeah, they copy each other all the time. Yeah.
Well, I mean, like X-Men is the Doom Patrol, and there's no way around that.
Welcome back.
You just missed me talking about Superman in the 60s and when he was macking on new broads every installment.
You were almost right, though. We did get off the Golden Age, but we're still stuck on like the early parts of the Silver Age. So.
Wow, I didn't miss the definition of when does the Silver Age end, which is the real discussion point I'll find interesting. But you're still starting the Silver Age.
I think we're about ready to move. I think to that point.
Okay.
So actually, now that you bring it up, let's move to that point. You basically you created the perfect segue. So now that you created the perfect segue, introduce the debate that interests you. You have the reins now.
Wow. Well, this is something I really don't have something in the race. I do know that the Batman TV show in that era is still the Silver Age. So sometime after that ended, and I would say either Denny O'Neill's Superman or Denny O'Neill's Batman, the Ra's al Ghul thing, that's certainly Bronze Age. That's the start of, I wouldn't say it's the start. I don't know what's the defining moment, but I do know that by that time, that's pretty much Bronze Age stuff.
Disco Wonder Woman. That's the one.
Sure. Yeah,
I like,
you're right.
Jim
You're right.
Tuner,
That
just
might
because
be.
it's a good year.
Yeah, what's that? 71,
69.
69. Okay.
For Marvel, okay, I think for Marvel, there really there is one definitive comic book moment that says Silver Age ends, which is Gwen Stacy dying. Death of Gwen Stacy.
Yeah, I can agree with that.
For Marvel, it's like that ended the Silver Age. It's done.
Okay, you see what I mean there? Again, we think of the Silver Age as being so campy, and yet that's like the most serious moment in all of comics.
I don't think that's true, but
it's up there. It's up there. We can be fair. We can be generous and say it's definitely up there. It's in the top 10.
Mm-hmm.
And
especially for the time, it might be the most serious moment in that age of comics.
That was 73, by the way. So
it's the definition of the time when you can't just say my webs can extend however far and they always stretch so you aren't hurt, and you just cover something like that, and instead you add some real science of I yanked too hard at the last minute and broke her neck, and it's sort of, you know what I mean about the comic. It's like you can always throw in my webs can hold up to 20 tons. Does it need to be 30 tons this month? 30 tons. And they disappear after an hour or however long it needs to be. That kind of stuff.
Are you throwing shade at my boy Peter Parker?
I'm just saying no. That's typical of like Green Lantern and all that sort of stuff. Where the rings can. It's like the rings. You really need your willpower, although they do automatically protect you. And it's like, well, which is it? There's sort of. Yeah. Go ahead.
No, you're good. You're good. Sorry, I didn't.
I was just going to say the ring. Green Lantern rings in the Silver Age really were kind of, they start talking on their own, and they do whatever you want to do. If you want to have them create a cage to hold the some threat and then fly off, that cage will still be here. If you aren't using your mentality, it should be gone. It's just it's like whatever you want it to do. Whereas they started getting really. In the Bronze Age, they started getting just the most. It's the least bit part of seriousness. The seriousness
they started adding
of real
more
world
rules
type
to
stuff.
You're talking about continuity and consequences,
right?
And basically the continuity and consequences were not really a factor as much for some of these books, and they started becoming much more paid attention to. I think the point Hutch is what you're making essentially.
Yeah,
that's part of a. And
if
this
you want
is
to put
also,
adult words on it, yes.
So here's my thing, though. I think this actually speaks to some of what I've been talking about with using some of these aesthetic shifts as being very clearly part of, very important in the signposts of these ages. Because it's not just like, sales necessarily. We really pay attention to when there was either I think either an artistic, like a depiction shift, or like a tonal one. The Death of Gwen Stacy is a tonal shift. It is a shift in tone. Peter Coogan in where he dates end of Silver Age, and he admits there's a little bit of arbitrariness to this, but he kind of says the shift from so he's less about the continuity and consequences, but he says the shift towards social content. So the fact that there is a social consciousness that develops at the end of the Silver Age and into the Bronze, and this is where you get your, I think this is where you get the Green Arrow, Green Lantern crossover, where they have to take their trek across America because superheroes are not just about their superpowers. It's what impact is this having on society? And so like that's kind of where he puts that shift in being.
I would throw in with that. That's right around the same time that. Wonder Woman had to lose her powers and become a woman, just, a woman who knows some martial arts. It's around the same time that my favorite team, the Metal Men, went from this goofy sort of, you can just, fly off into space and you'll find hundreds of planets that are about, an hour away. And, and it goes from that to, now the mobs hate the Metal Men and they have to become human beings in disguise and Brother Power the Geek and all that sort of, it's not really reflecting hippies, but it's sort of that whole social movement of unrest. Unrest is that era.
So-
again, this is once again almost synonymous with Marvel doing it first and DC panicking.
So
I'm
one
sure
of the
it
things I
is.
want to go back to, we're toward the end of the golden age, in our discussion about the golden age of American comic books was golden in several different ways, in creativity, in popularity, in sales, right? And it has a measurable peak and fall. If you look at those monthly sales numbers, there is no significant jump or change for the next like 2 decades, right? DC does have the DC implosion, and that sort of stuff that's going on in the 70s, which is firmly in Bronze Age territory. But it you can't track the market in the same way, because the people that are buying comics keep buying comics or passing their collections on to their younger siblings, some variation on all of that. And you can't, it doesn't have the same benchmarks that we have with the Golden Age, which I definitely think makes the Silver Age need to have other criteria to look at, because it doesn't have the same kind of uniform criteria shape.
But I would submit to you, and this is a bit of a challenge towards what you're putting down. If you're going to have an age system, what you're introducing is quite a bit of inconsistency in how it's being measured there.
Yeah.
So if we're going to be consistent about it, we would want to pick, okay, we're being thematic or sales. And if we're picking and choosing there, it's going to have, and this is part of the debate around it. I'm mostly pointing this out to kind of, add to the discussion, the debate about it. Because like I said, I think that's why I liked how you said it when you said it was a golden age in many respects, because we're painting out actually different aspects of it.
Yep.
My only other problem with this is that I would argue I can and I cannot argue this point, because on the one hand, I can't argue with how we just call it Golden and Silver Age, but I also hate how we called it Golden and Silver Age, because although there's a type of goldenness to the fact that there was so much inventiveness going on as they made up the industry, the Silver Age for many superhero fans is superior. People really got on board with the Silver Age, and with Golden Age, it's the least remembered of most superhero stuff. So I don't like the idea of the thing I don't like is the fact that the Silver Age is if we think about gold and silver, we typically think that gold is superior to silver, which implies that there's a step down somewhat.
Unless you're the Chinese.
Well, in America at least, but the opposite actually kind of happens. Things actually got better by most people. When I showed those two pages of Golden Age Captain America and the exact same scene told almost 30 years later, late Silver Age, Hutch was going, oh my gosh, like same artist, Kirby both times. And Hutch was saying, this Silver Age page is just screaming at me with its energy, and the Golden Age one
in fairness, Kirby had 20 more years of practice.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm not.
If
Yeah,
I may suggest, though, I think just about anything has its quote Golden Age, and the term can be applied rather loosely. It doesn't necessarily mean that gold is good. It's just like this classic age that we remember. I think the problem here is not it being called gold. It's the fact that we then follow silver up with bronze. And immediately now we are faced with that podium that always says, oh, yeah, gold is first place, silver is second place, bronze is third place.
Well,
right, so
again,
we're
looking at it through the Hellenistic grading period. If you actually go back to Greek mythology, there was a golden, silver, bronze age leading to a heroic age, and then an iron age, which is the age that we currently live in.
Yeah, but there's a sort of hierarchy there, and I don't like some of the implications of the hierarchy. Okay, right. Jim, I have to address Jim's comment. I'm not saying objectively 100% that the Silver Age is just better than the Golden Age. What I am saying is that for fans of superheroes, that is unfortunately partly the case. People who are Golden Age tend to be huge pulp fans, for example, right. And they love the gold. And I do see the appeal. Golden Age pulp has got its own charm. I completely admit that. If you're a superhero fan and you see those two, the Golden Age Captain America and Silver Age Captain America, and you go, which one of these do you want to read more of? I'm sorry, bro. It's going to be Silver Age, Captain America.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things that I do want to point out, though, is the people that defined the Golden Age and why it's so well agreed on is you got people like Roy Thomas and the letter writers and people that they named it during the Silver Age, right? That's what they called it.
Even before the Bronze Age existed.
So even before the Bronze Age existed, and
Okay,
definitely before
so
the quality thing, because when I was coming up, when I was first getting into comics, in fact, I brought a visual aid. I'm going to put myself on the screen here. So you guys all know I like trading cards, right? Is that something everybody knows?
Uh-oh.
Yeah.
So I got into trading cards, superhero trading cards, about the same time I got into comics. And one of my first sets was DC Cosmic Card set. Look at this thing. It's complete. So if you look at this here, you've got the Golden Age Blue Beetle and the Silver Age Blue Beetle and the Modern Age Blue Beetle as of 19 what the heck was that? Well, anyway, this was 92, I think this set was released.
Yeah.
So they were calling the Silver Age, the Modern Age from like, what was it, 71 when Charlton started releasing Blue Beetle up until the thing.
That's the Silver Age Blue Beetle to me. I mean, come on.
Well, and this is why it's the dumbest thing to ever call any age in any art movement modern. Because you know that age will end eventually, and then again, you're in the postmodern.
So,
I feel like for literature, modernism is fairly defined. It's
Yeah.
postmodernism gets in, and it gets really kind of sucky.
Because like with a lot of art movements, that's definitely true. But yeah, Jay Garrick, Barry Allen, Silver Age, Modern Age, Wally West, and rest in peace, Wally West. Anyway, point being.
Should be rest in peace, Barry Allen, but
yeah,
they brought him back. Yeah,
we can't talk about that right now.
Right.
We don't have time.
I think.
All right, well, let's. We need to get because we're almost at 2 hour mark, and we might have to do this in we might have to do this in 2 parts because what we want to do is at least start getting into our next age, and this is where the real debate begins.
Yeah,
because
where we actually end the Silver Age.
Where we end the Silver Age, because this is where different scholars, different fans, and different companies, as we can see, will start calling things by different names.
Well, and even with the Cosmic Card set, right? You got to realize that like those were the titles they gave were not consistent either, right?
So
I can illustrate.
Go ahead.
No, you go ahead, Hutch.
I would say at least it can't be. A lot of people are arguing 71. I can't think that the Bronze Age is later than 70 because I think Denny O'Neil's Green Lantern, Green Arrow is Bronze Age. So if that's, I would say it's at least then maybe earlier than April of 1970. But I would say I don't think that's Silver Age.
See, I would agree with that, and I also would echo along with the idea that we're talking about the death of Gwen Stacy earlier as a benchmark, but death of Gwen Stacy happens within a continuity, within a continuum where Marvel's story is they've already had the death of her father. You've already had the ridiculously adult Sin Eater story. You've had a bunch of stuff that's already been going on to set us up to the place where you have the death of Gwen Stacy and the death of Norman Osborn. So,
sure, but like just kind of like with like the at least for Marvel, kind of like how New Flash is Silver Age. I think transition that signpost. It's almost totemic. So I don't think we can ignore that. But I will say one thing
when is the death of Gwen Stacy?
73, I think you said.
73. Okay.
73. From 73, July 73. It looks like.
We'll see. Okay, when was let's look at this something here. We're talking about over in DC that a good signpost that the Silver Age is over is the Hard Traveling Heroes story, right? Mm-hmm. One of the events that happens in Hard Traveling Heroes is the Speedies hooked on heroin.
Oh,
yes.
That was weird, by the way. If you're gonna pick a drug,
when was the Spider-Man
heroin?
When was the Spider-Man anti-drug comic?
The Spider-Man. That's what I'm saying. What is the Spider-Man? The overdose.
Okay, that's the one. Okay, all right.
The Harry Osborn's overdose. That I think might actually be that kind of totemic shift you're talking about, more than the death of Gwen Stacy. And if for nothing else, and I don't even want to give it
that looks like that's. No, this actually is interesting. It looks like 171. So we're still talking. It's still only, again, we're quibbling over like a couple of years.
What's the year on that? What's the year on that?
71.
71. Oh, 71. Okay.
I still like 69.
We're dealing with similar. What I'm saying is that there's two things that we can find in common. A, the dates all seem to be within a few years of 1970. Like, so like if you were rounding, we would round up to 1970. So like, I'm putting that out there. So, you know, we can quibble about it's exactly here, it's exactly there. It's all basically around 1970, 1971. So that's a good commonality to point out.
I think Jim's got a great observation here. New Wonder Woman was at the end of 69, and New Green Arrow is, New 68, New Green Arrow 69.
It still rounds up to 1970. So we're still around that we're still there. The second point is that depending regardless of what you want to call this point, and this is where people will start throwing out different names. But regardless of what you want to call this, I think most people do agree on the fact that this shift in age, because there's definitely a tonal shift here, and I think that gets matched by some aesthetics as well.
Mm-hmm.
This shift is a shift from lighter content to definitely a shift towards maybe not darker, but definitely more serious in tone and in content. There is a tonal, there is a shift towards things not being the same lightheartedness that they were before. And I think most people can agree with that kind of general, there's a consensus around that general idea.
And one thing I like to bring up is Batman, a character who was specifically invented to scare the heck out of his enemies, ends up being the same guy who's featured in a comic, where the Pied Piper is literally trying to smoke him and Robin in a pipe, right? And then comes back to being the darker, sinister hero. That is a huge and very obvious jump.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny, you could almost take, Batman would be a good test case. I'm not saying it's universal, so I don't think we could use it for the whole system of ages, but he'd be a good test case to kind of like show like where he's at in these different ages.
Yeah.
It's very different depending on where you are.
No,
just alone.
Yeah, I do think the reimagining or return of Batman to the place the Grim Avenger is a definite mark around there.
Mm-hmm. In fact, can we also ask Death in the Family? Does that count as bronze?
Death of the Family is like 80.
That's where people start. That's where the debates start happening. Because
we're not gonna we can't end the Bronze Age on this show, guys. That's crazy.
No,
we just can't even do it.
But you get my point, though, right? Mm-hmm. 3 different Batmans there is what I'm talking about.
Yeah. Some people will put like Death in the Family, and it's like they'll go from bronze to then iron or copper or whatever. That's where things get, or they'll just lump both of those in and say it's the darker age. So this is where like the real debates begin. Right. Some people will start putting lots of more categories of ages, and they'll see a lot more distinctions. And some people will start grouping those together. And again, this to me, it reveals a lot about what that person who's making the list, what they're prioritizing. Are they prioritizing the artwork? Are they prioritizing the writing in terms of where they see the shifts? Are they prioritizing something else like sales? And so these things I think are all part of like how people are going to start categorizing what they see the ages to be post like Silver Age, which tends to have much more consensus.
Right. And Ra's al Ghul is 1971. Jim Tooner just noted about the Joker's 5-Year Revenge is 1973. So definitely, like I was saying, 70 by 70, you're starting the Bronze Age. I don't think it ends with Death in the Family because that's well into the post-crisis era when Robin has already been retconned from being a happy, cheery version of Jason Todd to being dark and willing to kill somebody and so
he was confused. He was, hormonal.
And I'm jumping ahead. I realize that, but it is 2 hours. We're probably not going to get to that.
Let's face it. The dude that he probably let die had it coming. Okay. let's move on.
We got a
from
new guy
that.
in chat. We have a new guy in chat. I want to shout out. Name looks like
Yeah.
K.
So
I'm new here. What are they doing? We are trying to figure out a very contentious debate about the ages of superhero comics, specifically, and how people label those things. And we basically, I think, have about wrapped up the part that most people agree on. So
next time we get into the real contentious stuff.
oh man, that's gonna be
Well, there's
awesome.
an interesting
That's okay.
thing here
Listen.
because I keep comparing this to the fine art movements, and it is at the modern, what we call the modern period, in which movement stops becoming a thing based on time period, and it becomes this deal of a whole bunch of movements. Like there's a new movement every week happening within this one much larger span.
Oh,
And
that's
I
what I was
wonder
gonna
if
say
we
is,
may see something like that happening here as well.
we're
Well,
going to see 100 years from now that all of this was for naught, because it's going to turn out that we were just at the death knell of the real golden age of comics.
Seen,
That's
yeah,
the show.
the
Everybody.
broader view of it, it'll be nobody will care. There were comics and then there weren't. That's it.
So
I have to say 1970, we go on about whether it's 1969, 70, 71 for the Bronze Age. 1970 is the year I was born. So it's kind of cool that that's when the it's like when all these things kind of happen. So that's when GLGA started. So
it's
like,
your fault, Hutch. You
yeah,
killed
I'm
me.
the Bronze Age guy.
all right, Metal, put it on there. 1970, this Bronze Age begins. Hutch is born.
Killed the Silver Age.
benchmark means
Yeah, Hutch killed the Silver Age. Thanks, buddy.
So
okay, I love it.
By the way, I was guess when I was born. We'll get to this later. Guess what exact year I was born?
86.
86. I was born when comics when some people say that superheroes died. So Hutch may have killed the
Hey,
Silver
we've got
Age,
2 people on the panel that killed things.
but I killed the superhero.
So you and Booster Gold, huh?
hey, I like Booster Gold.
I love Booster Gold. Wait, isn't he 1986 or is he 1987? No, he's 86, isn't he?
I think so.
I
We
don't
introduced him when Crisis was still on the stands.
Yeah, that sounds.
What's happening? I
I
hear
thought that was
music.
going to be like the intro.
My
to
alarm.
Oh,
That's my alarm to take my pills because I'm old.
I thought that was going to be our montage ending there. Slowly.
It sounds like the music to Cheers. Maybe I should have that playing. The time to wrap it up and say goodnight.
so Rob Liefeld killed the superhero in 1990. The
Oh,
death
no.
of the mutant. This was the end of the real golden age.
Well, there's always like
This
a
is going to
lull
be very
period,
contentious.
right, at the end of any age. So like, that's where we are right now. We're in that dying lull period of the actual golden age of comics. So that means that 100-year period, as we get closer to the 30s, we might actually see a resurgence in the new Silver Age of comics.
Yeah, maybe. So we want to go ahead here, and we're going to wrap the show for tonight. I know we got started a little bit late, and so you guys out there in internet land got a little bit shorter show. Sorry. Next week, we're not talking about the ages of comics. I want to for next week. But we're not. Next week, we are doing Superman. We're doing a review of Superman issue number 3, The Dawn of DC. So come back and listen to talk about modern comics, as in like made a couple months ago, and so we're going to be doing a spoilerific review of that next week, and then I'm thinking that maybe the week after next we'll pick up with the ages. So
yeah, we can do a break week since it's
we'll do a break week. Also, we're going to see if we can't pad out the audio, the panel a little bit to not have so many of those damn kids on it. So I'll use youngsters.
Lousy kids.
I would have gotten away with it too.
Hey, the youngest person on the panel is the one that's actually like running half of this stuff in the background.
I know.
So
and I appreciate it. I do appreciate it. So
you need your tech savvy kids around,
That's true. That's true. I'm really living up to these Gen X stereotypes. Okay, guys. We're gonna go ahead and call that the show. As I said, does anybody have anything they want to talk about before we go? Any projects that are in the works or things that they're excited about?
Just remind people commissions are open. If you want art from me, just send me a DM. Tell me what you want. I'll tell you what it costs.
All right, and I have my show on YouTube at You Lousy Kids. That's my channel. I stream 4 to 6 p.m. Central Time every day playing Zelda, and I'm getting so far into Zelda, I have to think about what I'm going to do next. So I might actually just start talking about stuff again, like you do, and I'll be a competitor to your show, and you'll never have me on again. So
that would be unfortunate.
Yeah. Because you can't have 2 shows about talking about comic books on the.
YouTube. I'm the only show on the internet that does.
That's
what I
right.
Do. I'm still the survey is out about what it is that we do here. Jim is absolutely busting my balls here. This is amazing. Yeah, get rid of those kids just when we start discussing more modern stuff after Gold and Silver Age.
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. I said an unreasonable, irrational thing. So, yeah. I think Twitter stepped away for a second, so he might actually miss the outro. But I guess while we're waiting on this, I'll let everybody know out there. You guys might know this, that I make comics. Well, idealcomics.net is back up on the old thing there, and at least for today. But you can head over there. You can check the links. It says read comics to a whole list of free comics on our website, on Global Comics, on Webtoon, and on some other places that are all within our universe. If you're interested in purchasing any of those books, you can see our Gumroad store. We've got some books for sale out there. And Global Comics has a few that are available for purchase as well. And you can also, in the description of this very video, guys, there is a link to my sort of personal Redbubble store where you can look at 8 fancy designs for t-shirts or stickers or whatever that I put out there. So yeah, check it out if you feel like it. I've been told they're not horrible, but they're not great. So we will eventually be putting a couple ideal shirts and stuff on there as well, specifically items that have shown up in universe that you can wear on your own person, but they're not ready yet. So check out the other crap I put up there. And also check out the Adventures of Omega Girl, which is Twitless's book. It's out there on Indie Planet. And of course, Cartoonicus and Twitless have been still doing Super School, so you can read their comic there. It's also free. I don't know that they want your money, but I do. You can also support the channel and the artists that go into making Ideal Comics products by supporting our Patreon. And as we have in process stuff, you get to see it being made. I haven't updated in a little while because my day job is taking up a lot of my life. But that's all the things. And yeah, we'll call that a show. Until next time, get out there and read some comics, especially Superman #3, so you can know what we're talking about next week. Bye.